45 did not arrive with balloons, a midlife crisis, or a sudden desire to dye one's hair blonde. For Alara Vance, it arrived with a siege of ivy. She woke to a room submerged in a subaquatic gloom. The morning light filtered through a curtain of green that hadn't been there the night before. Alara blinked, shifting beneath the heavy down duvet, the scent of dried lavender and old books rising from the linen. She pushed herself up, her joints protesting with a soft pop, and stared at the window. Yesterday, the English ivy had been a polite garnish around the sill, a charming botanical accent for her cottage, the rookery. Today, it was a barricade. Thick, ropey tendrils, the width of a man's wrist, had woven a lattice over the glass, effectively sealing her in. The leaves were impossibly large, glossy, and dark, pulsing with a vibrancy that felt less like plant life and more like a held breath. "Well," Alara whispered, her voice husky with sleep. "That's aggressive." She slid out of bed, her bare feet meeting the cool, uneven floorboards. She caught her reflection in the cheval mirror in the corner. She looked like a woman who had been planted in the earth and left to grow wild. Her auburn hair, a tangled mane that reached her shoulder blades, was streaked with new ribbons of silver. Not the gray of decay, but the shining metallic silver of moonlight on water. She didn't dye it. She didn't try to tame the soft curves of her hips or the way her stomach had rounded slightly over the last decade. She was becoming substantial, like a tree adding a ring. She walked to the window and placed a palm against the glass. Through the cold pane, she could have sworn the ivy leaned into her touch. A tingle, sharp and electric, zipped from her fingertips to her shoulder, smelling faintly of ozone and crushed basil. She jerked her hand back, clutching it against the oversized knit of her oatmeal-colored sweater. "Just static," she muttered, though her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Dry air, old house, just static. She turned to find Bramble, her massive scarred black tomcat, sitting on the end of the bed. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring intensely out the window, his tail twitching with an agitation that bordered on offense. He let out a low, guttural growl, then hopped down and padded out of the room without a backward glance, leaving Alara alone with the impossible greenery. Less than a mile away, beneath the relentless gray canopy of the sky, Professor Julian Thorne was considering the merits of murder. Specifically, the murder of the meteorologist who had promised clear skies. "It's going to pour, isn't it?" Julian asked, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the chest of anyone standing too close. He stood waist-deep in a trench, the cold mud of the excavation site clinging to his boots. He was a man built for libraries but shaped by labor. At 52, Julian possessed the kind of rugged intellectual magnetism that usually existed only in black and white photographs. His charcoal hair was swept back, silver threading through the dark strands at his temples, and his slate-gray eyes were narrowed behind wire-rimmed glasses as he scrutinized the soil strata. He had rolled the sleeves of his linen shirt to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and dusted with fine dark hair, the skin weathered to a golden teak by years of sun in Egypt and Peru. But this wasn't the Valley of the Kings. This was a damp field in the English countryside, rumored to be the site of a medieval plague pit, though Julian suspected something older lay beneath. "Forecast said sunny spells, Professor," his grad student, distinctively unhelpful in his clean vest, called down from the edge of the pit. "The forecast lies, Arthur." "The earth doesn't." Julian crouched, brushing a layer of clay from a protruding stone. "Hand me the trowel, the small one." As he reached up, a shadow fell over him. It wasn't Arthur. Perched on the edge of the trench, staring down with eyes like molten gold, was a black cat the size of a small bobcat. It looked at Julian with an expression of profound judgment. "Shoo," Julian said, his tone dismissive. The cat did not shoo. Instead, it slid down the muddy embankment with liquid grace, landing silently beside Julian's boots. It rubbed its cheek against his shin, leaving a smear of dark mud on his trousers, and began to purr, a sound like a diesel engine idling. "I don't have food," Julian told the animal, though he found himself reaching down to scratch the creature behind the ears. The fur was incredibly soft, contrasting with the animal's battle-scarred appearance. "And this is a restricted site. You're contaminating the context." The cat headbutted his hand, demanding more. Julian sighed, a half-smile softening the severe lines of his face. He straightened up, adjusting his glasses, and looked back at the wall of earth he had been scraping. Something was wrong with the stratigraphy. The soil composition had shifted abruptly from the compacted clay of the 17th century to something much looser, darker. It smelled rich, like peat and rot, but dry. "Arthur!" Julian called out, his voice snapping back to professional sharpness. Bring the spade. I hit something hard. Rock, sir? No, Julian murmured, running his thumb over a smooth, cold surface that poked through the dirt. It wasn't limestone or granite. It was slick, glassy, and blacker than the bottom of a well. Obsidian, volcanic glass. In rural England? Arthur laughed nervously. That's impossible, isn't it? Unless it's a trade item. It's a box, Julian said, ignoring the boy. He began to dig with renewed fervor, the muscles in his back bunching and shifting beneath the linen shirt. The rational part of his brain, the part that had written 3 textbooks on Neolithic trade routes, was cataloging the anomaly. But a primal part of him, the instinct that made him the best in his field, felt a cold bead of sweat slide down his spine. The air in the trench grew heavy. The wind died. The birdsong that had filled the morning ceased abruptly, leaving a ringing silence. The cat hissed, arching its back, but it didn't run. It pressed against Julian's leg as if anchoring him. Julian cleared the earth away. It was a box, roughly a foot wide, made of seamless obsidian. There were no hinges, no locks, just a surface so perfectly polished he could see his own reflection, distorted, dark, and strange, staring back at him. It's sealed, Julian muttered. He grabbed the spade. I'm going to leverage it out. Stand back. Alara stood in her kitchen, a mug of chamomile tea warming her hands, though the chill in her bones refused to dissipate. The cottage felt small today, tight, like a pair of shoes she had outgrown overnight. She looked down at the illustration she had been working on, a detailed watercolor of a Tropa belladonna, deadly nightshade. She had painted it 100 times, but today, the purple berries on the paper looked wet, glistening as if they were bleeding ink. 45, she thought again. Why does that number feel like a deadline? She took a sip of tea, trying to ignore the persistent humming noise that seemed to be coming from the floorboards. It sounded like a choir holding a single, discordant note. Her mind drifted, unbidden, to a memory she hadn't touched in 35 years. The funeral. Her mother's small pine coffin, the rain. 10-year-old Alara, standing by the grave, consumed by a grief so volatile, so hot and dark, she thought it might burn the world down. She remembered the game she had played that day, to stop the crying, to stop the scary things from whispering in the shadows. She had taken her mother's jewelry box, the black stone one, and she had whispered all her anger, all her fear, and that strange, terrifying heat inside her chest, into the box. She had buried it in the woods behind the churchyard, pretending she was burying a monster. I bind you, I bind you, I bind you, she had chanted. A child's rhyme, a nonsense spell. Alara set the mug down on the counter with a trembling hand. Why was she thinking of that now? The woods behind the churchyard were miles away, now a development site, or an excavation. The humming in the floorboards grew louder. The tea in her mug began to ripple, concentric circles radiating from the center. Bramble, she called out, looking for the cat. Silence. A sudden pressure built in the room. The air tasted metallic, sharp as a knife blade on the tongue, the drying herbs hanging from the ceiling rafters. Sage, rosemary, thyme, began to swing violently, though there was no breeze. Alara gripped the edge of the butcher block island. Her knuckles turned white. She felt a phantom sensation, not in the room, but inside her own body. It was a tugging, a thread pulling tight, stretching from her sternum through the walls of the cottage across the miles of damp earth. Someone was knocking at a door she had locked and thrown away the key to. Stop, she whispered, her eyes widening. The green of her irises flared, glowing with an internal luminescence. Don't touch it. Julian wedged the tip of the heavy iron spade under the obsidian box. The ground resisted, suctioning the object in place with a tenacity that felt deliberate. Careful, Professor, don't chip it, Arthur yelled. I know what I'm doing, Julian grunted. He planted his feet, his boots sinking into the mud, and applied leverage. The veins in his forearms bulged. He was a man of science, a man of logic. He did not believe that objects had wills. He did not believe that the air could suddenly drop 20 degrees in a second. But as he pushed, he felt a vibration travel up the handle of the spade. It wasn't the scrape of stone on stone. It was a hum, a frequency so low it rattled his teeth. The cat, Bramble, let out a shriek that sounded human and bolted up the embankment. Julian grit his teeth. Come, on. With a wet, sucking sound, the earth gave way. The box shifted. But Julian slipped. The spade slid against the slick, glassy surface of the obsidian. He tried to correct the angle, but the momentum was already there. The heavy iron edge of the spade came down hard, striking the center of the box not with a pry, but with a blow. Crack! The sound was deafening, like a gunshot in a cathedral. It wasn't just the sound of stone breaking, it was the sound of a seal snapping. A fissure of violet light erupted from the box, blindingly bright, shooting straight up into the gray sky. The shockwave hit Julian squarely in the chest, throwing him backward into the mud. Jet! In her kitchen, Alara screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear, but of impact. She was thrown back as if a physical fist had struck her solar plexus. She flew across the kitchen, crashing into the shelves of jarred preserves. Glass shattered. Strawberry jam and pickled beets exploded in a shower of red, looking horrifyingly like blood against the white walls. She crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, her hand clutching her chest. The cottage groaned. The ivy outside the window writhed, slamming against the glass, trying to get in. Alara looked down at her hands. They were trembling, glowing with that same faint, violet light that was currently searing the retinas of an archaeologist a mile away. The binding, the childhood game, it was real. She scrambled to her knees, ignoring the shards of glass cutting into her skin. The pain in her chest was subsiding, replaced by a terrifying, hollow emptiness. The thing she had locked away, the grief, the shadow, the raw, undiluted power she had been too young to understand, was gone. It was out. And someone had let it out. Alara grabbed the edge of the counter and hauled herself up. Her moss-green eyes were no longer soft. They were hard, ancient, and terrifyingly awake. Who, she hissed, the word causing the remaining jars to rattle, dared to dig that up? Dear listeners, please leave a comment about which city you are listening from and subscribe to the channel in the name of love. This will support me and give me inspiration for new stories. The air inside the mobile field office was stagnant, smelling of stale coffee, dry earth, and the distinct, dusty scent of things that had been buried for a very long time. It was a smell Julian Thorne usually found comforting, the perfume of history waiting to be catalogued. Tonight, however, the cramped trailer felt suffocating. Julian ran a hand through his charcoal hair, his fingers snagging on the silver threads at his temples, and sighed. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, peering down at the intruder who had effectively taken his desk hostage. I don't suppose, Julian said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that had silenced lecture halls for 2 decades, that you intend to move. Barnaby, a ginger tomcat with one ear that looked like it had been pinked by shears and a gaze that held the judgment of a deity, did not blink. He was currently sprawled across the preliminary stratigraphy reports, his tail twitching rhythmically against Julian's lukewarm mug of tea. The cat had appeared out of the brush an hour ago, walked up the metal steps of the trailer as if he owned the lease, and promptly settled in. Right. The silent treatment, Julian muttered. He leaned back in his creaking swivel chair, the linen of his shirt pulling tight across his chest. He rolled his sleeves up another turn, revealing forearms corded with the kind of muscle built by swinging pickaxes rather than lifting gym weights. You're fully aware that this is a restricted archaeological site, aren't you? We have permits. We have fences. We generally do not have freeloaders. Barnaby yawned, displaying a set of teeth that looked sharp enough to puncture steel, and began to aggressively groom a paw. Julian shook his head, a reluctant smirk touching the corner of his mouth. He was a man of logic, of carbon dating and soil composition, but he wasn't immune to the charm of a creature who simply didn't give a damn. He turned his attention back to the object sitting on the far corner of the desk, well out of the cat's reach. The box. It was obsidian, he was certain of that, though the texture was wrong. Obsidian was glass. It should be slick, sharp. This surface seemed to drink the harsh fluorescent light of the trailer, holding a matte finish that felt impossibly cold to the touch. They had pulled it from a layer of sediment that dated back to the mid-19th century, yet there wasn't a scratch on it, no tool marks, no hinges. What are you? He whispered to the stone. Barnaby stopped grooming. The cat's head snapped up, ears swiveling toward the metal door of the trailer. A low growl started deep in the animal's throat, a vibration that rattled the papers beneath him. Easy, tiger, Julian murmured, reaching out to stroke the cat's head. Barnaby swatted his hand away, claws sheathed, but the message clear, focus. Then Julian heard it, the crunch of boots on gravel outside. It was a purposeful stride, too light to be his sight foreman, too heavy to be a scavenger. A sharp knock rattled the aluminum door. It wasn't a polite inquiry, it was a demand. Julian stood, his 6'2" frame filling the small space. He unlocked the latch and pushed the door open, bracing himself to dress down a confused hiker or a local teenager looking for trouble. The words died in his throat. Standing in the halo of the trailer's external floodlight was a woman who looked as though she had been grown from the very earth he was excavating. That was the first illogical thought to fire across Julian's synapses, and he frowned at it instantly. She was wrapped in an oversized cable-knit cardigan, the color of oatmeal, which slipped off one shoulder to reveal creamy, pale skin. Beneath it, a dark dress clung to soft, generous curves that demanded a man's attention. But it was her face that held him. She wasn't young. She possessed the rich, unapologetic beauty of a woman in her prime. Her hair was a wild mane of deep auburn, unbrushed and glorious, with streaks of moonlight silver woven through it like precious metal in a vein of copper. And her eyes, moss green, luminous, furious. "You," she said. Her voice was husky, like wind moving through dry leaves, but it carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate in Julian's sternum. "Can I help you, madam?" Julian asked, recovering his composure. He leaned against the door frame, crossing his arms. He knew the effect he had on women. The distinguished professor act usually worked wonders. But this woman looked at him as if he were a particularly slow-witted student. "You have my cat," she stated. She didn't look at him. She was looking past him, peering into the trailer with an intensity that was unsettling. "Your cat?" Julian glanced back at Barnaby, who was now sitting upright, looking smug. "The ginger terror? He wandered in an hour ago. I assumed he was a stray." "Barnaby is no stray. He's particular." She took a step closer, and Julian was hit by her scent. It wasn't perfume. It was complex and earthy, crushed rosemary, damp soil, and something sharp and electric, like the air right before a thunderstorm breaks. It made the hair on his arms stand up. "Well, you're welcome to retrieve him," Julian said, stepping back to allow her entry. "Though I warn you, he seems to have developed an attachment to my paperwork." Alara Vance stepped into the trailer, and the atmosphere in the small metal box shifted instantly. The air grew heavy, thick with a pressure that popped Julian's ears. She didn't move toward the cat, though. She moved toward the desk, toward the obsidian box. Julian's instincts flared. He moved quickly, placing himself between her and the artifact. He was a man of science, but he was also a man who protected his discoveries. "Careful," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "That is a delicate find. We haven't even begun the cataloging process." Alara looked up at him, and at this proximity, Julian could see the fine lines fanning from her eyes, the dusting of freckles across her nose. She was breathtakingly real, a stark contrast to the sterile academic world he inhabited. Her eyes searched his face, dissecting him. "You dug it up," she accused, her voice trembling slightly. Not with fear, he realized, but with suppressed anger. "I felt the earth scream when you severed the roots, but I hoped I was wrong. I hoped it was just a shifting of the plates." Julian blinked, his slate-gray eyes narrowing behind his glasses. "The earth screamed, 'Madam, we are conducting a standard excavation of a mid-19th century homestead foundation. We use trowels and brushes. We are hardly fracking.'" "You don't know what you're holding," Alara snapped. She tried to step around him, but the trailer was narrow, and they were suddenly very close. Her hip brushed against his thigh, and a jolt of heat, purely physical and startlingly intense, shot through him. She froze, her lips parting in a small gasp. Her eyes widened, the green depth swirling with confusion. She felt it too. Julian cleared his throat, stepping back a fraction to preserve his professional dignity, though his pulse was hammering a traitorous rhythm against his collar. "I assure you, I am quite qualified to identify this object. It appears to be a decorative box, likely imported, fashioned from volcanic glass. A curious anomaly for a rural cottage, certainly, but it's not a box," Alara interrupted, her voice dropping to a whisper. She looked at the black stone with genuine dread. "It's a prison." Julian let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A prison? For what? Very small, very naughty beetles?" "Do not mock what you don't understand, Professor," she warned. She knew who he was. Of course she did. Everyone in the county knew Julian Thorne was digging up the old Miller property. "I deal in facts, Ms. Vance, Alara Vance. Ms. Vance. I deal in facts, in history, in things I can measure, weigh, and date." He gestured to the obsidian object. "This is stone. It is heavy. It is cold. It is not a mystical prison. It is an artifact." "It is a binding," she corrected, her hands clenching at her sides. "And by pulling it from the earth, by breaking the seal of the soil, you have woken it up. You need to put it back. Tonight. Right now. Julian studied her. She seemed entirely rational, despite the nonsense she was spouting. She didn't have the manic energy of the conspiracy theorists who sometimes plagued his sights. She stood with her feet planted firmly apart, radiating a fierce, protective power. I can't do that, Julian said softly. It's already been logged. It goes to the university lab in the morning. You cannot take that thing into a city, Alara said, panic rising in her tone. She lunged for the desk. If you won't bury it, I will. No! Julian moved to intercept her. They reached the desk at the same moment. Barnaby hissed, a sound like tearing canvas, and leaped from the desk to the top of a filing cabinet. Alara's hand, rough from gardening and warm with life, slapped down onto the surface of the obsidian box. Julian's hand, calloused and large, clamped over hers to stop her from taking it. Contact. The moment their skin met, with the cold black stone beneath them, the world went white. It wasn't a spark, it was a sledgehammer of energy. A shockwave blasted outward from the point of contact, blowing the papers off the desk in a violent whirlwind. The overhead lights flickered and burst with a loud pop, plunging the trailer into darkness, save for the moonlight streaming through the open door. Julian was thrown back, stumbling against the metal lockers. The air punched from his lungs. He gasped, his chest heaving, his entire arm numb and tingling, as if he'd stuck a fork into a main socket. What in the hell? He wheezed, adjusting his glasses, which had gone askew. Alara hadn't been thrown. She was leaning against the desk, gripping the edge for support, her chest rising and falling rapidly beneath the knit sweater. In the shadows, her eyes seemed to be glowing with a faint, impossible light. The air in the trailer smelled of ozone, burnt wiring, and lavender. Julian pushed himself off the lockers, his rational mind scrambling for a foothold. Static, he muttered, his voice shaking. Dry air, synthetic carpet, just a massive static discharge. He looked at Alara, waiting for her to agree, waiting for her to acknowledge the laws of physics. Alara slowly straightened up. She rubbed her hand where his had touched hers. She looked at him, and the expression on her face wasn't fear anymore. It was a dawning, terrified realization. That wasn't static, Julian, she whispered, using his name for the first time. The sound of it on her tongue felt intimate, dangerous. She looked down at the box. In the darkness, a hairline fracture appeared on the smooth obsidian surface. A faint violet light pulsed from within the crack, beating in time with Julian's own racing heart. You didn't just wake it up, Alara said, her voice trembling. We just gave it a heartbeat. The rain had begun an hour ago, a persistent, rhythmic drumming against the Victorian glass panes of the greenhouse. It was a cold rain, unseasonal for the time of year, washing away the dust of the day and replacing it with the scent of wet stone and awakened earth. Inside, however, the air was thick, humid, and perfumed with the heavy, narcotic sweetness of night-blooming jasmine. Alara Vance stood at her potting bench, her hands buried deep in a mixture of dark loam and crushed eggshells. She needed the ground. She needed to feel the tangible, messy reality of soil beneath her fingernails to counteract the vibrating, electric terror that had settled in her marrow since the incident in the storage unit. The box had cracked. She had felt the entity inside taste the air, and worse, she had felt it taste Julian. A heavy knock on the greenhouse door shattered the quiet. It wasn't a tentative tap. It was 3 solid, authoritative thuds, the sound of a man who didn't like being kept waiting. Alara wiped her hands on her heavy canvas apron, though the dirt merely smeared into the fabric. She pushed a stray lock of wild auburn hair out of her eyes, a strand that seemed to have turned entirely silver in just the last few hours, and walked toward the door. Through the condensation-fogged glass, she could see a silhouette, broad shoulders, a rigid posture, and the glow of a flashlight cutting through the rain. She opened the door, letting a gust of cold, wet wind swirl into the tropical warmth of her sanctuary. Julian Thorne stood on the threshold. He looked like a man at war with his own reality. His charcoal hair was plastered to his forehead by the rain, and water dripped from the rim of his glasses, but his slate-gray eyes were burning with a stubborn, intellectual fever. He wore a waxed canvas jacket over his linen shirt, clutching a leather satchel to his chest as if it contained the crown jewels. I need to understand, he said. No preamble, no pleasantries. His voice was gravelly, roughened by the chill and the shock he refused to admit was fear. Alara blocked the doorway, her body creating a soft, curved barrier against his sharp angles. It's past midnight, Julian. The university is closed. The dig site is closed. The laws of physics, however, are open 24 hours a day, he countered, stepping closer. He smelled of rain, old parchment, and that unique, crisp scent of ozone that seemed to cling to him since the box had pulsed. And what happened in that storage unit violated about 6 of them. I've gone over the data, the structural integrity of the obsidian, the atmospheric pressure. None of it accounts for the light or the heat. Go home, Professor, Alara said softly, her heart aching for him. He was a moth flying straight into a bug zapper, convinced it was just a particularly bright candle. I can't. He held up the satchel. I took rubbings of the markings before the event. I can't translate them. It's a dialect of Proto-Canaanite I've never seen, mixed with symbols that shouldn't exist in that region. You're the botanical illustrator for the Preservation Society, but everyone in town says you're the one to talk to about local history, about the folklore. Alara sighed, her breath hitching. Folklore, the polite academic term for the blood and bone of her ancestors. She looked at his face, the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the determined set of his jaw. He wasn't going to stop. If she shut the door, he would just keep digging until he broke the seal completely and unleashed hell on this sleepy little town. Come in, she murmured, stepping aside. Before you let all the heat out. The orchids are temperamental. Julian stepped inside, and immediately the atmosphere shifted. The greenhouse was Alara's external heart. Vines of passion flower twisted along the iron rafters, and ferns the size of carriage wheels created intimate, shadowed alcoves. It was a place of aggressive, vibrant life. He blinked, his glasses fogging instantly. He took them off, wiping them on the dry underside of his shirt, revealing those piercing gray eyes that always seemed to be dissecting the world. As he put them back on, a low, rumbling growl emanated from beneath a bench of potted rosemary. Barnaby, Alara's Maine Coon, a cat the size of a bobcat with the disposition of a hungover royal, stalked out. He had eyes like gold coins and fur the color of storm clouds. Easy, Barnaby, Alara warned. But instead of hissing, the massive cat trotted straight to Julian. Barnaby sniffed Julian's wet trousers, let out a sharp, demanding meow, and promptly wound his body around Julian's legs, rubbing his face against the professor's shins with aggressive affection. Julian looked down, startled, his hand instinctively dropping to scratch the cat behind the ears. Well, hello to you too. You're a sturdy one, aren't you? Alara stared. Barnaby hated men. Barnaby barely tolerated her on Tuesdays. He likes you. Animals usually do, Julian said distractedly, looking around the greenhouse. It's the humans I have trouble with. This place, it's extraordinary, Alara. It's like stepping into a lung. The air is so rich. It's the datura, she said, walking toward a wrought iron table nestled beneath a canopy of wisteria. She gestured for him to sit. And the night-blooming cereus. Potent things, dangerous if mishandled. She uncorked a bottle of deep, blackberry red wine that had been breathing on the table. She didn't ask if he wanted any. She simply poured 2 glasses. Julian sat, placing his satchel on the table and pulling out a sheaf of papers covered in charcoal rubbings. I want to hire you, Julian said, taking the glass she offered. His fingers brushed hers, a brief, electric contact that sent a jolt straight to Alara's toes. It wasn't the static of the box. This was warmer, human, and terrifyingly pleasant. She pulled her hand back, curling her fingers into her palm. I'm an illustrator, Julian, not a research assistant. A consultant, he corrected, leaning forward. The soft yellow light of the hanging lanterns caught the silver threads in his hair, turning him into something distinguished and undeniably handsome. He rolled up the damp sleeves of his shirt, revealing forearms corded with muscle, the arms of a man who dug his own history out of the dirt, not just read about it. The symbols reference flora, roots, bindings, seeds. I need someone who understands the, let's call it the organic history of the valley, the myths regarding the land. Alara took a long sip of wine, the tannin coating her tongue. She looked at the rubbings. Even upside down, she recognized the sigils. The binding of the 3, the lock of breath. She had to be close to him. She had to watch him. If she left him to his own devices, he would pry that box open with a crowbar in curiosity. I have conditions, she said, her voice dropping to a huskier register that seemed to catch in the humid air. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly, intrigued. Name them. First, Alara said, pointing a finger at him. You do not touch the artifact again without me present. Not a nudge, not a brush of dust, nothing. It is unstable. geologically unstable, or do you want my help or not? He clamped his mouth shut, a muscle feathering in his jaw. Fine, agreed. Second, you stop trying to rationalize everything you see. Sometimes, Julian, a thing is just what it is. If you try to force logic onto something that operates on emotion, you'll break it, or it will break you. Julian let out a dry, skeptical laugh, reaching for his wine glass. I'm a scientist, Alara. I don't believe in magic. I believe in cause and effect. He gestured with his hand, an expansive movement to emphasize his point. His elbow struck the heavy wine bottle sitting near the edge of the iron table. Time seemed to liquefy. The bottle tipped. It was heavy glass, full of dark red liquid, destined to shatter against the stone pavers. It would be a mess of glass and stain. Alara didn't move her body. She couldn't reach it in time. Instead, she pushed with her mind. It was a reflex, a muscle memory honed over 4 decades. She envisioned a soft cushion of air, a hand made of will. The bottle stopped falling. It hovered, impossibly, at a 45-degree angle, 3 inches off the table's edge. The wine inside didn't even slosh. Panic flared in Alara's chest. Too much, too obvious. Julian was turning his head, his reflexes kicking in a second too late to catch it himself. In the split second before his eyes could focus on the impossible defiance of gravity, Alara lunged. She physically grabbed the neck of the bottle, slamming it back down onto the table with a clatter that rang through the greenhouse. Careful! She gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Julian froze. He looked at the bottle, then at her hand gripping it, her knuckles white. He blinked, the rational processor in his brain overwriting the glitch he thought he'd seen. God, he breathed, running a hand through his damp hair. Clumsy. My apologies. I could have sworn that was going over. Reflexes, Alara said, forcing a tight smile. She released the bottle and smoothed her oversized knit sweater, trying to hide the trembling of her hands. I have very good reflexes. Julian looked at her then, really looked at her. The skepticism faded, replaced by something far more dangerous, curiosity. He wasn't looking at the botanist anymore. He was looking at the woman. The air in the greenhouse grew heavier, charged with something that wasn't barometric pressure. He leaned in, crossing the invisible boundary of personal space. The smell of him, rain, expensive soap, and the musk of a man who worked with his hands, washed over her. He inhaled deeply, his eyes fluttering shut for the briefest of moments. Jasmine, he murmured, his voice low, vibrating in his chest. And ozone. You smell like the storm, Alara. Alara felt a flush rise from her neck to her cheeks. She was 45 years old, a widow, a witch, and a woman who had long decided that romance was too much trouble to cultivate. But the way he said her name, wrapping his tongue around the vowels, woke up parts of her she had thought were dormant. It was a slow burn, a deep ache in her belly that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the biology he loved so much. It's the greenhouse, she whispered, unable to look away from his mouth. His lips were parted slightly, his breathing matching hers. No, Julian said, opening his eyes. The slate gray had darkened to the color of the ocean before a squall. It's you. It's intoxicating. He reached out, his hand hesitating in the air before he tucked a loose strand of her silver-streaked hair behind her ear. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, a gesture so intimate it felt like he was reading the history written on her skin. I haven't, Julian started, then stopped, his throat working. Since my divorce, I haven't found anyone, that I couldn't explain, until I walked into this greenhouse. Julian, she warned, but she didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. The magic in the room swirled, the vines above them seeming to reach down, sensing the surge of energy. Be my consultant, he whispered, his thumb brushing her lower lip. Help me solve this. I don't want to do it alone anymore. Alara opened her eyes. The moss green met the slate gray. This was a bad idea. This was a catastrophic idea. He was digging up the things she had buried, and he was making her want things she had forgotten. Okay, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos inside. I'll help you, but the contract needs to be sealed. A contract? He smiled, a slow, crooked expression that made him look 10 years younger. Do we need a notary? Just a hand, she said. She held out her hand. Julian gripped it. His hand was warm, large, engulfing hers. As their skin met, Alara intended to cast a simple binding of protection, a small, invisible ward to keep him safe from the box. But as she pushed the magic into his skin, something went wrong. The moment their palms touched, a shockwave blasted through the room. It wasn't the violet light of the box. It was gold. Pure, blinding, solar gold. The windows of the greenhouse rattled in their frames. The wine bottle shattered, exploding outward. Julian gasped, his eyes going wide, but he didn't pull away. He couldn't. His hand was fused to hers by a magnetic, searing heat. Alara tried to break the connection, but her magic wasn't obeying her. It was pouring into him, and terrifyingly, something from him was pouring back into her. A strength, a grounding, earthen stability that she had never felt before. "Alara?" Julian shouted over the sound of the wind suddenly howling outside. "What is this? What are you doing?" "I'm not doing it," she cried out, staring at their joined hands. The veins in Julian's forearm were glowing with a faint, golden tracery, pulsing in time with her own heartbeat. She looked up at him, horror dawning. This wasn't just a spark of attraction. The box hadn't just awakened itself. It had awakened a circuit. "Let go!" he yelled, panic finally cracking his stoic facade. "I can't!" Alara screamed. Suddenly, the force threw them apart. Julian crashed backward into the potting bench, soil raining down on him. Alara stumbled against the iron table, gasping for air. Silence slammed back into the room. The rain outside stopped instantly. Julian lay amidst the spilled soil and broken terracotta, his chest heaving. He held up his hand. On his palm, burned into the skin like a brand, was a symbol. It matched the one on the obsidian box exactly. He looked at Alara, his face pale, his glasses askew. The desire was gone, replaced by a profound, primal fear. "Alara," he whispered, staring at his hand. "Why is my skin burning?" Alara looked at her own palm. It was unmarked, but it tingled with a phantom sensation. She looked at the man who was supposed to be just a skeptic, just a nuisance. "Because," she whispered into the terrified silence, realizing the contract they had just signed was far more permanent than she intended. "You just became the key." The sky didn't simply open, it tore apart. Following the explosion of force in the potting shed, the heavens unleashed a deluge so heavy it felt personal, a curtain of gray water designed to hem them in. They had scrambled from the wreckage of the greenhouse to the sturdy stone cottage Julian was using as his field office, the sprint leaving them both breathless and drenched. Julian slammed the heavy oak door against the howling wind, locking it with a decisive click that echoed in the sudden quiet of the room. The roar of the storm was instantly muffled, reduced to a relentless drumming against the leaded window panes. But the air inside was not still. It was charged, heavy with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of something ancient waking up. "Towels," Julian muttered, his voice rough. He pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose, water dripping from the silver-threaded charcoal hair that was plastered to his forehead. He didn't look at her. He was looking at his hand. Alara stood by the hearth, shivering not from the cold, but from the residual hum of magic vibrating in her marrow. Her oversized knit sweater, usually a comforting armor, was sodden and heavy, clinging to the curves she preferred to keep hidden. She watched Julian move to a vintage basin in the corner. He turned the tap, running cold water over his palm. The brand was still there, a spiral knot searing red against his sun-weathered skin. "It's a chemical burn," Julian said, though the tremor in his deep baritone betrayed him. He grabbed a linen towel and wrapped his hand tight, his knuckles white. "Some reactant in the soil mix, combined with the friction." "Julian," Alara's voice was soft, barely more than a rustle of dry leaves. "Soil doesn't glow before it burns you." He spun around, his slate-gray eyes piercing. In the dim light of the cottage, stripped of his professorial composure, he looked dangerous. Not malicious, but raw. The wet linen shirt clung to his broad shoulders, the rolled-up sleeves revealing forearms corded with muscle, the body of a man who dug for his answers in the dirt, not just in libraries. "Then explain it, Alara," he demanded, stepping closer. The scent of him hit her. Rainwater, old parchment, and a deep, spicy note of sandalwood that made her knees weaken. "Explain how a box buried for 3 centuries heats up in a cold greenhouse. Explain why my hand feels like I've grabbed a live wire." Before she could answer, a low, guttural growl emanated from the shadows beneath the heavy mahogany desk. Barnaby, the massive Maine Coon who had appeared on Julian's doorstep 3 days ago and refused to leave, stalked out. His bottle-brush tail twitched with agitation. He wasn't looking at Julian. He was staring at the obsidian box, which Julian had instinctively snatched up and brought inside with them. It sat on the center table, innocent and black as a starless night. Thrum. The sound wasn't audible so much as felt, a tectonic vibration that rattled the teaspoons on a nearby tray. The air pressure in the room dropped sharply, popping Alara's ears. "Did you feel that?" Julian whispered, his skepticism warring with his senses. He moved toward the table, his scientific curiosity overriding his pain. "Don't touch it," Alara warned, stepping into his path. She needed to distract him. If he examined that box too closely, if he translated the inscriptions with that brilliant, stubborn mind of his, he would find the binding spell she had cast in a past life she was only just beginning to remember. "Julian, please. It's unstable. It's an artifact, Alara, not a bomb." He tried to sidestep her, but she held her ground, her moss-green eyes wide and pleading. "It's not just history," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You think everything is strata and carbon dating, layers of dead things waiting to be cataloged. But some things aren't dead. They're just dormant." Julian stopped, forced to look at her. He was close enough now that she could see the droplets of water caught in his eyelashes. He looked down at her, his expression shifting from frustration to something more complex. Intrigue. "And you think this is alive?" He gestured vaguely at the box, though his eyes remained fixed on her lips. "I think the line between history and myth is thinner than your tenure committee would like to admit," Alara parried, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was improvising, dancing on the edge of a precipice. "You dig for truth, Professor. But you only accept the truths that fit in your glass display cases." A wry smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, softening the severe lines of his face. "Are you calling me narrow-minded, Ms. Vance?" "I'm calling you safe, Julian." The name felt heavy and intimate on her tongue. "You like the past because it can't surprise you. It can't hurt you." The air in the room seemed to thicken, turning viscous and hot. The storm outside lashed against the stone walls, isolating them in a capsule of firelight and shadow. The hum from the box grew louder, a continuous drone that made Alara's teeth ache, but Julian seemed to have forgotten it. His focus had narrowed entirely to the woman standing before him. He took a step forward, invading her personal space with a confident, predatory grace. Alara retreated until her lower back bumped against the edge of the large drafting table. She was trapped, between the storm outside, the magical artifact humming behind him, and the devastatingly human man in front of her. "I don't feel particularly safe right now," Julian murmured, his voice dropping an octave. He placed his hands on the table on either side of her hips, effectively caging her. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from his body was a tactile thing. Alara looked up at him, her breath hitching. She was 45 years old, a woman who had resigned herself to a life of quiet gardens and solitary teas. She wasn't supposed to feel this sudden, violent blooming of desire that felt like a vine tightening around her heart. "Then why don't you back away?" she challenged, though her voice lacked any real conviction. "Because I'm a scientist, Alara," he said softly, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. "When we encounter an anomaly, we don't run away. We investigate." He raised one hand, the uninjured one, and tucked a wet lock of auburn hair behind her ear. His fingers grazed the sensitive skin of her neck, rough and warm. The touch sent a jolt through her that rivaled the lightning outside. It wasn't magic. It was chemistry, pure and undeniable. "You're an anomaly, Alara," he whispered, his gaze searching her face, cataloging every freckle, every fine line, every secret. "You talk to plants. You smell like sage and rain even when it's dry. And when you're in the room, the world tilts." "Julian," she meant to push him away, but her hand settled on his chest instead. The wet linen was cool, but the skin beneath was scorching. She could feel the steady, powerful thud of his heart. "Tell me," he pressed, his lips brushing against her temple, making her shiver. "Tell me why the box hums when you're near. Tell me why I feel like I've known you for 1,000 years. Barnaby hissed from the corner, a sound like tearing silk, but neither of them looked. The shadows in the room were stretching, twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist, reaching toward the couple, bound in the tension of the moment. Alara looked into his slate-gray eyes and saw her own reflection. She saw the fear, yes, but she also saw a hunger that mirrored her own. He wasn't looking at her like she was a witch or a monster. He was looking at her like she was the only mystery he ever wanted to solve. Some things, she breathed, her resistance crumbling, can't be explained in a lecture hall. Show me, he commanded, his voice rough with need. He tilted her chin up. The air was electric, the oxygen sucked out of the room by the impending storm and the impending kiss. Julian lowered his head, his intent unmistakable. It was slow, agonizingly deliberate. He was giving her every chance to run, and she was frozen, rooted to the spot not by magic, but by want. As his lips hovered millimeters from hers, the obsidian box let out a shriek of resonance. Simultaneously, a bolt of lightning struck the oak tree directly outside the window. The world exploded into blinding white light. The boom shook the cottage to its foundation, rattling the teeth in Alara's skull. In that split second of absolute illumination, the glamour Alara held over herself shattered. Julian jerked back, his eyes wide behind his glasses. He didn't look at the window. He was staring directly into her eyes. For a heartbeat, the moss green was gone. In its place, her irises swirled with a luminous, terrifying violet light, the color of raw magic, of storms, of the void between worlds. Darkness crashed back into the room as the lightning faded, leaving them in the gloom. Julian stood frozen, his chest heaving, his hand still hovering near her face. The desire in the air had curdled instantly into shock. Alara, he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer or a curse. What are you? The question hung in the air, heavier than the humidity of the breaking storm. What are you? Alara opened her mouth. The truth lodged like a stone in her throat, but the universe answered for her. On the heavy oak table between them, the iron-bound box, the artifact Julian had spent 3 months meticulously excavating from the muddy banks of the hollow, let out a sound that defied physics. It was a scream of metal, a high-pitched keen that vibrated in the fillings of Alara's teeth. Julian spun around, his archaeologist instinct overriding his shock. Don't touch it, he barked, though Alara hadn't moved. The iron bands snapping were louder than the thunder. One by one, the ancient metal gave way, flying across the room like shrapnel. One shard embedded itself in the plaster, next to Alara's head, smoking slightly. Get back, Julian lunged, not toward the artifact, but toward her. His arm, solid and corded with muscle beneath the rolled linen sleeve, hooked around her waist, hauling her behind the bulk of his own body. The box exploded. It wasn't a combustion of fire, but of shadow. A wave of force knocked them both backward, sending them crashing into the shelves of dried herbs. Jars of mugwort and dried lavender shattered, raining fragrant dust and glass down upon them. The room plunged into a supernatural chill, instantly freezing the breath in Alara's lungs. From the ruins of the box, a column of darkness rose. It was viscous, oily, swirling with a malevolent consciousness that Alara recognized in the marrow of her bones. It was the echo of a binding she had performed 20 years ago, a piece of wild, chaotic magic she had foolishly thought buried forever. The entity swirled, testing the air, confused by its sudden freedom. The cottage groaned. The windows rattled violently in their frames, and the air pressure dropped so sharply it made Alara's ears pop. But it was the energy in the room that changed everything. The release of the binding created a vacuum, a sudden, violent tear in the energetic fabric of the space, and nature, in its desperation to correct the imbalance, rushed in. It hit Alara and Julian simultaneously, a surge of raw, unadulterated adrenaline mixed with the chaotic residue of the spell. It was the fight-or-flight instinct stripped of civilization, a primal, driving need to affirm life in the face of absolute void. Julian dragged her up from the floor, his hands gripping her upper arms tight enough to bruise. His slate-gray eyes were wild, stripped of their usual academic detachment. His glasses sat askew on his nose. He looked at the swirling shadow, then down at her, and the fear in his gaze transmuted instantly into something scorching. "Alara!" he rasped, his voice rough with grit and smoke. The air crackled with ozone and arousal. It was a chemical reaction, volatile and inevitable. The proximity of death made the blood sing in their veins. Alara felt the magic humming under her skin, seeking a ground, seeking a tether. She looked at Julian, this man of logic, of dirt and stone and history, and saw the only solid thing in a world dissolving into chaos. She didn't think. She reached up, tangling her fingers in the silver-threaded charcoal of his hair, and pulled his mouth down to hers. The kiss was a collision. It was desperate, bruising, a frantic clash of teeth and tongues. Julian made a guttural noise deep in his chest, a sound of surrender and conquest all at once. He didn't pull away. He crushed her against the wall, his body a heavy, welcome weight shielding her from the room. The storm raged outside, and the shadow whirled in the center of the room, gathering strength. But in that corner, there was only the frantic heat of skin on skin. Julian's hands were everywhere, rough, capable hands that knew how to handle delicate things, but were currently tearing at the barriers between them. He ripped the oversized knit of her sweater, seeking the warmth of her flesh. When his calloused palm found the curve of her breast, Alara gasped, arching into him. The magic in her blood flared, hot and gold. It wasn't gentle. It couldn't be. This was the storm breaking. It was the years of polite nods and shared teas incinerated in a second. "Julian," she breathed against his neck, inhaling the scent of him. Rain, old paper, and the musk of a man pushed to his limit. He lifted her, his strength surprising her, wrapping her legs around his waist as he pressed her into the plaster. There was no finesse, only a starving need to be close, to be inside, to anchor themselves against the void. When they joined, it was with a friction that sparked like flint and steel. Alara cried out, the sound lost in a clap of thunder that shook the floorboards. They moved together in a frenzy, a rhythm dictated by the pulse of the breaking spell. Every touch was a claim, every breath a jagged intake of life. Julian buried his face in the crook of her neck, his glasses gone, his defenses shattered. He drove into her with a possession that terrified and thrilled her, grounding her wild, escalating power with his sheer, undeniable humanity. For a few minutes, the world narrowed down to the friction of skin, the taste of salt, and the heat radiating between them. It was a furious, life-affirming climax that left them both gasping, clinging to each other as the wave crested and broke, leaving them trembling in the debris of the herb jars. Alara's head rested on Julian's shoulder, her heart hammering against his chest. His arms were still locked around her, rigid as iron. Then, the temperature in the room dropped to absolute zero. The silence that followed was unnatural. The wind outside had stopped. The rain had ceased. Julian stiffened. He slowly lowered Alara's feet to the floor, though he kept one arm protectively across her chest. He turned his head. The shadow had finished coalescing. It was no longer a cloud. It was a figure, tall and gaunt, composed of nothing but the absence of light. It had no eyes, but Alara felt its gaze. It was hungry. It had been starving for 20 years. It lunged. "Move!" Julian roared. He shoved Alara behind him, grabbing the closest thing to a weapon available, a short-handled trench shovel he'd left leaning by the door. It was a tool of science, meant for scraping away layers of dirt, not fighting demons. The entity swept forward, a claw of darkness materializing to strike. Julian swung the shovel with all the force of his laborer's build. The steel met the shadow with a sickening crunch. But it wasn't the entity that broke. The metal of the shovel shattered like cheap glass, the handle splintering in Julian's grip. The force of the impact threw him backward, landing hard against the overturned table. He groaned, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, struggling to rise. The entity towered over him, raising a nebulous arm to deliver the killing blow. Something inside Alara Vance snapped. Not the fragile snap of a twig, but the terrifying crack of a glacier calving into the sea. The fear evaporated. The shame of hiding, the desire to be normal, the decades of suppressing the hum in her blood. It all incinerated in the furnace of her rage. This thing dared to touch him. It dared to threaten the man who had just anchored her to the earth. She stepped forward. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She walked between the fallen man and the monster. Alara raised her chin. Her oversized sweater hung off one shoulder, her hair was a tangled mane of auburn and wild silver, and her lips were swollen from Julian's kisses. She looked entirely undone and utterly terrifying. The entity hesitated. It recognized the signature. It remembered the jailer. Alara raised both hands, palms facing outward. She didn't speak a spell. She was past the age of rhyming couplets and sweet herbs. This required the deep roots, the crone power, the earth blood. "Enough," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it resonated with the harmonics of the tectonic plates beneath the cottage. Her moss-green eyes were gone, consumed entirely by a blinding, incandescent violet. She unclenched her internal fist. The restraint she had placed on her core at age 25 was ripped away. A shockwave of pure, white energy blasted from her palms. It was the light of 1,000 moons concentrated into a single beam. It hit the shadow entity with the force of a freight train. The creature didn't scream. It unraveled. The darkness was simply erased, scrubbed from existence by the sheer purity of the light. The entity disintegrated, turning into harmless gray ash that swirled for a moment before settling on the floorboards like snow. The light faded. The violet drained from Alara's eyes, leaving them their usual soft green, though they were wide and trembling. The cottage was silent. The smell of ozone was overpowering, mixed with the faint, musky scent of their recent intimacy. Alara stood panting, her hands still raised, smoke drifting from her fingertips. She slowly lowered her arms, the adrenaline crashing out of her system, leaving her knees weak. She turned around. Julian was sitting amidst the wreckage of his life's work and her dried garden. He was bleeding from the temple. His shirt was torn open, revealing the chest she had just pressed herself against. He was gripping the splintered handle of the shovel, his knuckles white. But he wasn't looking at the ash on the floor. He wasn't looking at the broken window. He was looking at her. His slate-gray eyes were wide, clear, and focused with a terrifying intensity. There was no skepticism left in them. No rationalization, no professor trying to explain away the data. There was only the raw, naked shock of a man who is seen behind the curtain of the universe. Alara clutched the torn neckline of her sweater, trying to pull the fabric of her ordinary life back together. But it was too late. The illusion was ash on the floor. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling. He slowly pushed himself up to a standing position, wincing slightly. He didn't move toward her. He didn't back away. He just stood there, breathing hard, his gaze tracing the silver streaks in her hair, the glow still fading from her skin, the impossible woman standing in the wreckage. "You," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of fear, but heavy with a realization that changed everything. "You are the storm." "I am not the storm, Julian," Alara breathed, the words scraping against a throat raw from chanting. "I am merely the vessel it broke." Her knees gave way. It wasn't a graceful, melodramatic swoon. It was the utter cessation of physics holding her upright. The magic she had poured into the binding, the ancient terrified working required to seal what his excavation had so foolishly disturbed, was now exacting its toll. The universe demanded balance. It was taking her heat. Julian moved faster than a man of 52 usually moved, faster than a tenured professor should have been capable of. He caught her before she hit the floorboards, his arms banding around her waist and shoulders. The impact drove the breath from him, but he didn't let go. He smelled of dust, expensive starch, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone that filled the room. "Alara," he gritted out, lowering them both until he was kneeling, cradling her against his chest. "You're freezing. You are... God, you're ice." "The cost," she whispered, her moss-green eyes fluttering shut, the luminous quality within them dimming like a dying coal. Her skin, usually flush with the vitality of her garden, was turning a translucent, bruised violet. "The breach is closed, but I am unmoored. I'm drifting." Julian shifted, pulling her tighter, his mind racing through a catalog of logical explanations and finding the drawers empty. He had spent 30 years digging for truth in the strata of the earth, categorizing civilizations by their pottery shards and bone fragments. But the woman in his arms was defying every law of thermodynamics he knew. She was fading, not dying, erasing. "Tell me what to do," he commanded, his voice vibrating against her ear. It wasn't a request. It was the tone he used when an excavation trench was collapsing, urgent, authoritative, terrified. "I need an anchor," Alara managed, her hand seeking the warmth of his chest. Her fingers, usually stained with ink and chlorophyll, looked ghostly against his blue linen shirt. "I need something real, something unshakable, to tie me back to this plane." "I am here," Julian said roughly. "I have you." "Not just presence, Julian. Essence." She opened her eyes, and the desperation in them shattered his last reserve. "You have to believe I'm here. You have to want me here more than you want your logic. If you doubt, even for a second, I slip away." He looked down at her. He saw the woman who argued with him over tea about the sentient properties of rosemary. He saw the woman who had captivated him, not with glamour, but with the quiet, devastating intelligence that shone through her untamed beauty. He looked at the silver streaks in her auburn hair, shimmering now with a terrifying ethereal light, and he felt the sheer, crushing weight of a world that might not contain her. The skepticism that had defined his career didn't dissolve. It was simply rendered irrelevant. It was a tool for the classroom. This was survival. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," Julian murmured. He shifted his grip, sliding one large, warm hand to the nape of her neck, his thumb resting against the erratic pulse there. "You are Alara Vance. You are flesh and blood. You are the earth under my feet." "Hold me," she gasped, a tremor racking her body that rattled his own teeth. Don't let the current take me. He didn't know what current she meant, but he felt it then. A suction, a vacuum in the air trying to pull her out of his arms. It was a physical force, a magnetic drag. Julian planted his boots on the floorboards. He tightened every muscle in his laborer's build, the strength he'd earned shifting limestone and clearing rubble. He was the stone. She was the wind. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of dried sage and rain that clung to her skin even now. "I've got you," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "Stay. Damn you, Alara. Stay with me." She began to chant again, but this time it was a whisper, a tether being thrown. As she spoke the words, Julian felt a shockwave travel from her skin into his. It wasn't painful, but it was profound. A sudden, dizzying awareness of the life force humming within her. He felt the beat of her heart as if it were inside his own chest. He felt the terror of the void she was fighting. He offered himself up as the counterweight. He poured every ounce of his stubbornness, his history, his absolute refusal to be alone again, into the connection between them. "I am the ground," he thought, willing the concept into her. "I am the archaeology. I am the proof that things endure." The air in the room screamed, a high-pitched whine of pressure equalizing, and then with a sound like a heavy book slamming shut, silence fell. The cold receded. The unnatural violet hue faded from Alara's skin, replaced by the pale flush of exhaustion. She slumped completely against him, heavy and warm and beautifully, wonderfully solid. Julian didn't move for a long time. He just sat on the floor of her cottage, holding the witch who had turned his world upside down, listening to the rain begin to patter against the roof, weeping for the man he used to be, and thanking whatever gods were listening for the man he was becoming. Chet, 3 years later. The bell above the door of Vance and Thorne Apothecary chimed with a cheery, brassy note announcing a gust of autumn wind and a customer seeking relief from the damp coastal chill. Julian looked up from the ledger spread across the polished oak counter. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, a small, private smile touching his lips as he saw who had entered. It wasn't a customer. Alara swept in, shaking a dripping umbrella, her cheeks flushed pink from the wind. She wore a thick, oversized cardigan the color of oatmeal, sleeves pushed up to reveal wrists adorned with copper bangles. She looked vibrant, earthy, and entirely, miraculously alive. "It is absolutely foul out there," she announced, dropping a basket of wet foraging greens onto the counter next to a sleeping, ginger-furred lump. Barnaby, the massive tomcat who had decided 3 years ago that Julian was his personal furniture, opened one golden eye, judged the wet basket with disdain, and stretched a paw out to rest possessively on Julian's forearm. "I warned you the pressure was dropping," Julian said, closing the ledger. The spine of his own book, The Mythology of the Coast, a scientific examination of the unseen, gleamed from the display stand near the window. It had been on the bestseller list for 6 months. The academic community called it controversial but brilliant. Julian just called it an apology. "You and your barometers," Alara scoffed, though her eyes were soft. She rounded the counter, bringing the scent of rain and crushed pine needles with her. "I had to get the last of the mugwort before the frost hits tonight." She stopped beside him, hip-checking him gently. Julian abandoned the accounts instantly, turning his stool to face her. He reached out, his hands finding purchase on her waist, pulling her into the space between his knees. The movement was practiced, easy, the muscle memory of a marriage built on a foundation of surviving the impossible. "You're cold," he murmured, his hands rubbing warmth into her lower back. "I have you to warm me up," she replied, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into that velvet tone that still made his breath hitch. Julian looked at her, really looked at her. In the soft amber light of the shop, surrounded by jars of dried herbs and the artifacts he had curated for her shelves, the memory of that night 3 years ago was always present. He remembered the feeling of her fading. He remembered the terror. He ran a thumb over her hip bone, grounding himself. She was here. She was anchored. "Always," he promised. He leaned in, brushing his lips against hers, tasting the rain and the wildness she would never fully tame. "How is the inventory?" "Replenished," she murmured against his mouth. Then she pulled back slightly, her moss-green eyes sparkling with a mischievous secret. "Although we might need to expand the section on protective charms." Julian raised a silver eyebrow. "Oh? Is the tourist season bringing in more bad energy than usual?" Alara took his hand, guiding it from her waist to rest flat against her stomach beneath the heavy wool of her sweater. The warmth of her skin seeped into his palm, scorching him. Not tourists, she whispered, her smile tremulous and blinding. But I have a feeling we're going to need a very strong anchor again. About 7 months from now. Julian froze. The world narrowed down to the sensation of his hand on her belly. The skepticism that had once been his shield lay rusted and forgotten in the past. In its place, wonder bloomed, fierce, protective, and overwhelming. He looked at his wife, the witch who had unearthed his heart, and saw the future stretching out before them, terrifying and beautiful. Another storm? He asked hoarsely, his eyes wet behind his glasses. Alara covered his hand with hers, interlacing their fingers tight. The best kind, Julian. The very best kind.